Hello, and welcome to Anime Audio Commentary. Today I'll be commenting on episode 53 of Fullmetal Alchemist Brotherhood. If you'd like to watch along, then start watching now. So last we left off, things were really starting to heat up in Central. There's all sorts of chatter going on about how the Flame Alchemist, the hero of Ishval, has turned enemy of the state, and things are going, I guess, rather poorly. I do find it interesting that despite what is essentially open conflict going on, there are a lot of people who are essentially just living life as normal. Now, I think this right here is sort of like the masterstroke on Mustang's part, in that he's leveraging Mrs. Bradley to try and garner some sympathy. It was a rather misinformed order that would have had her shot, but, it's not like Mustang was acting entirely in the right, but he's sort of finagled things so that they work to his favor. I mean, ultimately, we know Mustang is doing a good thing, but, just the way it looks, it doesn't look like a good thing, but he's, at the very least, managing to sort of sway public opinion. And the really brilliant thing is that he's managing to broadcast this essentially all across the country, so even if things go south in Central, more or less everybody knows about what had happened, and, just because he's sort of gotten out his side of the story first, I feel like people would be more likely to believe him, and ultimately side with him if push came to shove. Yeah, I feel like that's a little sword of Damocles hanging over everybody's head. That, she doesn't even know that Wrath is gone, nor that her son, supposedly, is a homunculus. I feel like dropping this news on her in the middle of broadcast is kind of a callous thing to do, but I guess the idea here would be to gain further sympathy. The idea is they're delivering this bad news, and because they're clearly on the side of Mrs. Bradley, that must mean they oppose this too, even though, secretly we all know they were responsible for the bombing of the train. Yeah, so that was a rather cunning thing to do, to sort of paint this picture that there is some enemy of the state here going on and doing stuff, and Mustang is merely trying to restore the proper authority to power. That's not really the case. He is in actuality opposing these monsters that are in charge, but, the public doesn't necessarily need to know that, It would be easier to sort of simplify things, I guess. I mean, it's not good lying to the public, but I don't know. There's sort of like two layers of good versus evil here, and one of them is a lot harder to believe at face value. It's one of those interesting moral quandaries where lying isn't a good thing, but at the same time, regardless of whether or not the lie is present, the underlying morality of what's going on is more or less the same. The good guys are still the good guys, the bad guys are still the bad guys, but the true nature of what's going on has been obfuscated just because, telling the average citizen that they are homunculi and they've got this big evil plan to essentially sacrifice all of you and to steal your souls, that's a rather hard pill to swallow, and I'd imagine the average person wouldn't really appreciate the full gravity of the situation, I feel. So it's very interesting that this whole thing seems to be taking root. That, oh dear, this is a really good sign. The average citizens are sort of believing it, but that Ishvalan refugees who would have, a lot to hold against Mustang, that they would side with him is a really strong indication that Mustang is doing the right thing and is acting nobly. And, of course he is, maybe not as noble as he would like to portray, but I mean, obviously I can only assume this was all part of the plan for the Ishvalan refugees to sort of side with Mustang. I like how these officers are sort of talking about how they don't have that much firepower. I can only imagine they're about to bring in an armored division or something from Fort Briggs, because they were messing around with tanks earlier. I can only imagine things are about to get totally off the rails. Oh, there we go. They need a tank to breach the main gate. How's that for coincidence? It's rather unfortunate that he was just sort of standing right in the line of the tank shell. So it would seem that, considering how they have to fight off this big horde of marionette soldiers, I feel like Mustang would be rather well suited towards fighting them. If he just sort of scorches them, utterly immolates them to their component carbon, probably not a whole lot they can do about it. And I'd imagine he'd be able to scorch them all in pretty short order. I feel like everybody's glossing over the obvious thing. Mustang can just sort of burn them all repeatedly and they'll eventually stay down. Because, beating them is only marginally effective, as is shooting them, so I guess, scorch them, melt their flesh, and they won't be able to get back up even if they are still alive. It really is scary how utterly effective Mustang is, how he's able to create these ultra-precise bursts of fire that sort of swirl around his friends and allies. Yeah, see, there you go. Scorch them to ash and they can't get back up. Man, that is a first-hand glimpse at just how terrifying Mustang would have been in Ishval. And I guess knowing that, it really says a lot that the Ishvalan refugees, in an act of subterfuge or otherwise, that they would be willing to side with him openly. So, if I'm not mistaken, this episode right here is one of my favorites for reasons that are about to become apparent. Envy, it would seem, is just sort of crashing down into the path of the Elric brothers and company. And lest we forget, Envy was responsible for the death of Hughes, and Mustang is still gunning for the killer. So that these two would sort of encounter each other, only good things can happen. So Envy, as always, is unpalatable. But I don't know. I don't think he realizes quite how out of his depth he is, considering he's outnumbered, 8-1, give or take? Yeah, he can turn into a big monster and stomp on people, but a bunch of these combatants have already beaten him several times. Now, it's interesting that Envy is sort of getting up to his old tricks about trying to stoke dissension. Scar and Mustang, they shouldn't be working together by all logic. But at the same time, they are. And Envy doesn't quite get why. I think part of that is that he's not human. He doesn't understand how humans think. But at the same time, maybe it's... I don't know. I feel like Envy almost shows more pride than pride does in how utterly arrogant he acts. So speaking of arrogance here, Mustang is very clearly goading him. So that's the $1 million question. He's asking about Hughes and who killed him. And the idea here is that he's already calling Envy stupid and arrogant. Envy's repeating the obvious lie. And the idea is that, he doesn't really know the full extent of the situation. He thinks Maria Ross is actually dead. So the idea is that he's going to try and tease Mustang about wrongly killing someone. So, on the one hand, I feel like this is an act on Mustang's part, but on the other hand, I know he's somewhat serious about it, considering how strongly he feels about the death of Hughes. I wonder if he already sort of knows, but he's just sort of steeling himself for the actual confession. So it's very clear that, Mustang is definitely surprised, but he's still fishing for a little bit more concrete evidence. Because Envy can shapeshift, but he was actually dumb enough to prove it in front of everybody incontrovertibly. Now this is why this is one of my favorite episodes. Mustang is not going to be playing anymore, and Envy has just earned himself an incredibly painful death. You know, it's bad enough that Envy proved that he is the killer, but now he's gloating about it. And gloating about it while appearing as Hughes' wife. So I feel like Envy, by boasting, is really displaying just supreme arrogance, because he doesn't realize that of all the people who have killed homunculi, Mustang is, he's up there tied with basically everyone else. On the one hand, it's kind of nice that Mustang says, everybody else get out of here, there's better stuff you can be doing. But at the same time, it's kind of just because he wants to burn Envy to death slowly and at his own leisure. Yeah, Mustang's really not playing anymore. Like, man, isn't it cool how quickly your tongue flashes into vapor? So notably, Hawkeye is still staying here. I guess the idea is that she intends to keep her promise to keep Mustang on track, Obviously killing Envy is a big goal here, but if he takes it too far, I'd imagine she'll step in. It must rankle Envy a little bit that everybody is so utterly confident that Mustang can handle him. Envy, if nothing else, he's fairly prideful, so thinking that one mere alchemist could handle him, it's gotta tick him off at least a little bit. So Envy really means business now, he's transforming into his fully monstrous form. The idea being, he's probably hoping he can crush Mustang easily and get it over with. Of course, he doesn't really seem to have considered that maybe he should stop talking and start acting. Yeah, I'd imagine that has to be supremely painful to not only have your eyes vaporized, but also to be scorched all over your body. He is regenerating from all these wounds, but only now is he really realizing that Mustang had used this sort of tactic to kill Lust, Death is a definite possibility for Envy, and he was just sort of teasing him without really thinking things through. So, if a slow death was on the table before, it's gonna happen now. So while Mustang is taking care of Envy, the others are just delving deeper and deeper under Central. The idea being that they're going to try and find Father and deal with him if at all possible. I find it interesting that this tunnel is just sort of filled with all kinds of cables. I have to wonder precisely what their purpose is, but it sort of reminds me of, underground power lines almost. Or at least that's what it makes me think of. Now we're getting a little interesting bit of foreshadowing here. Or maybe not foreshadowing, interesting commentary where Scar says, in essence, I recognize myself and Colonel Mustang right now. It's not good how off the deep end he's going. And, to be fair, he is kind of going off the deep end. It would be better if he just killed Envy nice and quickly. Ooh. Yeah, Envy probably wasn't thinking this through too clearly. I find it interesting how he screams and cries, what's wrong with you, as he wears the face of Mustang's dead friend to try and get him to hesitate. Envy really doesn't seem to learn from any of this. Yeah, that's a rather unsettling line of dialogue where Envy's screaming about his eyes being gone. I'd imagine that is incredibly painful, but it really is no less than he deserves. So it would seem as though Mustang has sort of been hunting Envy in these tunnels, and now Hawkeye has decided to go in and cover him, rather than just hang back like she said she would. Naturally, this will become an issue, I'd imagine. If there's a third person in the mix here, then that means Envy could credibly disguise himself as one or the other, and attempt to fool the third person. Now, whether or not he's actually capable of doing so convincingly remains to be seen, but, it was good enough for Hughes way back when. There's a good argument to be made here that perhaps Mustang would be a little too angry to think as clearly as perhaps he could. So far, it seems like they're both sort of paying attention, albeit cautiously. Yeah, you have to wonder, who is actually Envy in that situation, considering how they both seem to be acting normally? Alright, well that's it for this episode. If you've enjoyed it, then by all means, tune in for the next one. See you, Space Cowboy.